My name is Ron Oliver. I am a volunteer for the Forever Balboa Park Association. It's an organization that was put together. It's been around for a long time with different names, and it's created to promote and improve Balboa Park. Balboa Park's the second oldest urban cultural park in the United States, second only to New York Central in age. New York Central is 3 years older than Balboa Park. It was set aside in 1868. The total acreage of the park when it was set aside was 1,400 acres. A fun story about that is the reason we set aside the park for the citizens of the future is when the United States took over California from the Mexican government, one of the requirements in the Pueblo agreements was to set aside a free and open public parkland in each of the pueblos. And so they finally decided to do that in San Diego in 1868. That was in the 1830s. In 1868, they were looking around. The population of San Diego was about 2,300 people. Downtown San Diego was about 700 acres, and most of the people involved on the council and involved in the civic activities of San Diego at the time were people in real estate. So they figured, well, we better set aside this parkland because we're trying to sell land and we don't want to sell some property that could be taken over and condemned for a park. So interesting about the creation of the park, as I said, it was set aside in 1868 when two members of the city council, actually one member of the city council and Alonzo Horton, who was one of the promoters of San Diego at the time, said we better set aside this land for a free and open park. So they started looking around where to do it, and they got up here on this mesa and they looked around and they said, you know, nobody's going to want to buy this property. It's just sagebrush and rattlesnakes and jackrabbits. So they went back and recommended to the city council, originally 360 acres, but the council approved 1,400 acres. Now the unique thing about that is all of downtown was only 700 acres. So they donated, set aside, twice the size of the existing downtown San Diego for a free and open park. Don't you wish we had politicians like that today? So that was the creation of the park, actually being designated an official city park. It sat pretty much dormant up until the 1990s. The first real development that occurred in the park, other than an orphanage and some cattle ranches and things like that, was when Kate Sessions came to San Diego. She was a very well-known horticulturalist, educator, and she wanted to start planting plants in San Diego, and she needed a nursery. And so she went to the city council and asked them to set aside 30 acres in the northwest corner of Balboa Park, right near where the Marston building is right now, the Marston House. And they gave her 30 acres, and in exchange she said, I will plant 100 trees every year in Balboa Park and another 300 trees around the city of San Diego instead of having to pay rent. And that was a pretty good deal for the city. So she was the first one really to do any improvements. In 1902, George Marston, the Marston House is named after, it was his house. They started looking around thinking, you know, we really should do something with this open land. And so he commissioned the Parsons to a landscape architect to come in and do a design on what he felt it should look like. The Parsons, another connection to New York Central, the Parsons brought in the Olmsted brothers, who were famous for their park designs. They did one in Buffalo. They were instrumental in designing New York Central, the park in Seattle. They helped him design the layout of the roads and where different things were going to be located in the park. The plan was approved, went to city council, it got approved, but nothing really happened with it. Another significant event that happened in San Diego that has an impact on the park, and as we go talking I will explain more how that happens. But in 1908, President Roosevelt took the Great White Fleet around the world. 14 battleships went around the world to show the supremacy of the United States in the international naval community. When they stopped here in San Diego, they looked around and they said, you know, if we ever have a military presence on the West Coast, it should be in San Diego. The great strategic location of San Diego in the Pacific Ocean, the protected port is perfect for a navy. So if we do it, we should do it here. Well, the founding fathers at the time, the leaders of the city at the time, realized, okay, we better keep that in mind as we go forward. Flash forward to 1910, San Diego finally realized, was told that after decades of starts and stops, the Panama Canal was finally going to be completed and open. San Diego was the first port of call in the United States when you come through the western side of the Panama Canal. So they said, well, they're going to have two World's Fairs, one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast. We think San Diego should be the one on the West Coast. So they got their delegation together, went back to Washington, D.C. to get the designation of the World's Fair to celebrate the opening of the Panama Canal. They got there about the same time San Francisco showed up. At the time, San Diego had about 40,000 residents. San Francisco had 280,000 residents. So guess who won that argument? Fortunately for us, our delegation was not deterred by that, and they came back and said, we're still going to do it anyway. And we're going to have two goals when we set aside the land and do the development for the World's Fair. The first goal will be to attract the military, and the second goal will be to increase the commerce. All of these buildings on the Prado were created for the 1915 World's Fair. They were built in Spanish Renaissance architecture, and the designs are unique because when you look at the design of the buildings, they have a little influence both of Spain and South America in what they're doing in the design. The main architect was Bertrand Goodhue. He was the lead architect and designer of the fair and the buildings. And he was the one that led the team that put all of these buildings together and put them up. Now, another interesting story about the park, like all World's Fairs, the buildings, all but four of the structures were supposed to be torn down when the fair closed. And think about it. What's left from the Seattle World's Fair? The Space Needle. What's left from the St. Louis World's Fair? The Arch. All the other fairs around the world, almost all of them, tore all their buildings down after the fair was completed. Even San Francisco, who became the official designate, up until recently, they only had one building, and I've heard recently they were thinking of tearing it down. But so they tore down their buildings. But San Diego had four buildings that were supposed to be permanent. One of those buildings is the Organ Pavilion that was built by the Spreckels brothers, the Spreckels sugar barons. It was built, it's now the largest outdoor musical instrument in the world. And the largest outdoor pipe organ in the world, has more than 5,000 pipes ranging in size from 10 inches to 32 feet. And they play a free concert there every Sunday at 2 o'clock. That was to be permanent and be free for people of San Diego to use all the time, according to the Spreckels family. Four structures that were supposed to remain permanent. I told you about the Organ Pavilion. One of the other ones is the Cabrillo Bridge. It was the first spanning bridge of its kind built, the largest in the United States. And it was meant to be the grand entrance to the Exposition. There were two entrances, one from the west, which is where the Cabrillo Bridge is now, and the other to the east, now where the B. Evenson Fountain is, and there the trolley line went there. Another number 3 of the buildings that were to be permanent is the California building. And you see the California Tower there. It's interesting, I talked about the combination of Spanish and South American influence on the architecture that Bertrand Goodhue did. If you look at the building, you'll see that the tall tower and a smaller dome to the side of it. It's all one building, and no, it was never a church, but it was patterned after a basilica in Sevilla, Spain, the tower, and then the domed part on the side of it was actually from a basilica just north of Mexico City. So there again, you see the influence of the European and the South American architectural style to create the building. That was to be permanent. And then the other permanent building, is we will see it in a little bit, was the Botanical building. It was one of the largest arboreums of its type, built. We haven't rebuilt it since it was constructed in 1914, but they're in the process now of rebuilding it. They've replaced the lath on it a couple times, but never the steel structure. And it's kind of fun to see. I actually like the steel structure when you look at it. It's kind of unique architecture. But those are the 4 buildings that were supposed to remain permanent. All the other buildings were meant to be torn down because they were all built as temporary buildings. And when I say temporary, what it was is there was sort of like a plaster of Paris and palm fibers were put in to make the exterior stucco finish. It was all wood construction, no concrete footings anywhere. All full with 2x14 sill plates and studs went up the wall. Back in 1978, the Electric Building, which is now home to the History Center, the Museum of Photographic Arts, and the Model Railroad Club. By the way, the Model Railroad Club is one of the largest ones in the world. The building burned down. Arson evidently threw a cigarette in a dumpster. They were in the process of rebuilding the building, so the facade, a lot of the ornamentation had been taken down, and the fire went up a palm tree. Once it got into the attic, built in 1915, no draft stops or anything, went from one end to the other and burned to the ground. Well, that year, come Christmas time in December, they were saying we need to get people into the park. And so the museums got together with a couple other groups, and they did the first, at the time it was called Christmas on the Prado. And it was a small event. They drew maybe 4,000 people. The thing I remember so much from it was Santa Claus was riding on a fire engine, and they were throwing, you can't do this now, throwing candy out from the fire engine and everything, and they had bands, and they had performers from the junior theater, the youth ballet, and it was just a fun event, and that's how it started. This is a map of the original plot of the 1,400-acre Balboa Park that was designated to the city. There's one little section that would be perfectly square, but they had already sold off the southwest corner of the park, so they couldn't purchase that. But this is the original 1,400 acres. It's now down to about 1,200 acres because we have Navy Hospital, the 2 freeways going through, San Diego High School and Roosevelt Junior High School, taking about 200 acres. So now the total net acreage is about 1,200 acres. The Center Mesa, which is the cultural center of the park, is home to the 17 museums that we have in Balboa Park, as well as the world famous San Diego Zoo. And the fun thing I always like to talk about the zoo, it's known internationally for its animal collection, but its horticultural collection is actually larger and more valuable than the animal collection. And people keep saying, why in the heck would that be? Well, what do most animals eat? Plants. If you're the buyer, purveyor, would you rather go looking for these all over the world to ship in, or would you grow them on site? So a lot of the plants that they grow in there are meant as food for their animals. So this is the Plaza de Panama. It was the ceremonial location in Balboa Park for any activities that they had to do large major celebrations. But it's also concentrations of a lot of the main buildings. The first one we'll talk about is the Timken Museum of Fine Arts. It was created by the Putman Timken Foundation. They had a very huge art collection. The 2 Timken sisters moved to San Diego and said, we want to donate the paintings we have there to the citizens of San Diego. We have 3 conditions. We want to decide where it can go, what the design is, and how it's operated. So they chose Balboa Park. There used to be a beautiful older building from the 1915 Exposition that was getting in kind of shaky shape and had to be torn down. So they said, well, we'll tear it down and we'll build a new building to go there, but we want it to be more of a modern architecture. So they chose an architect to design it and build it. There was a huge outcry which caused the creation of the Committee of 100 by B. Evenson. The Committee in 100 was created to protect and preserve all the other buildings in the park area on the Prado from being torn down and built with modern architecture. So the museum is open 6 days a week. It's the only free museum we have in the park, which was one of the conditions. It's the only place in San Diego you can go see a Rembrandt free. We had two expositions here, one in 1915 and one in 1935. 1915 was to celebrate the opening of the Panama Canal. 1935 was to try and draw us out of the depression we were in. And so you have different architectural styles that reflect the two different periods, although most of the buildings remain the same. The Museum of Art here originally was located over in the California building. They were going to move it over here to where it was. The building got condemned and they had to tear it down, so they rebuilt it, and they rebuilt it in almost exact replica of what it was in the past. The only thing that's exactly the same is the entrance with the statues and the clamshell. But if you'll notice, it doesn't have any windows. Well, why is that? What's the worst thing that a painting could have? Sunlight. So they don't have much sun in it. Another thing that they ran into problems with later on, this was in 1928 when it opened, is they also built the height of the ceilings are only about 12, 14 feet tall, which means if you had any statues or ornamentation like that, artwork given to the Museum of Art, it was hard to display it because, first of all, even if you could get it in, could you stand it up? And if you could stand it up, you'd be standing 5 feet from it to look at it. Well, that's not the way you look at sculptures. So they created on the other side here, this is another building built in the mid-60s before the Committee of 100 got started. And so there's a modern design. They have the Copley Auditorium on the right. In the middle is a outdoor patio restaurant now called Panama 66. Great food, 18 locally crafted beers on tap, as other things, more farm-to-table food. And understand, San Diego is the craft beer capital of the world. We have more than 280 craft breweries in San Diego. Behind that is the outdoor sculpture garden, which is where they put all of the sculptures. And in the past, this plaza here used to be lined with statues. There's a couple that are left, but when the pandemic first hit, they removed most of the statues because if you remember back when it first started, different statues were getting vandalized for different reasons, and they didn't want their artwork to get destroyed. So this is the Old Globe complex. It was built, there was originally a garden here, but for the 1935 exposition, they built the Globe Theater, an exact replica of the Old Globe Theater in England. It was built with no roof in the center, the same seating that you had in the original Globe Theater. And that stayed there and performed every summer. In fact, to this day, it's still the longest running Shakespearean festival performance in the world, as far as we can tell. In the last 30 years, it's had more than 28 plays premiere here at the Globe Theater and go straight to Broadway. Hairspray, Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, How the Grinch Stole Christmas, 28 of them went from here straight to Broadway. So this is the California Quadrangle in the California building, along with the administration building, which was a permanent building, and the building, part of the building behind me, which is part of the California Quadrangle. Between the California building and the Botanical building, they're probably the most iconic photograph structures in the entire county of San Diego. And you got to remember, the county of San Diego is as large as the state of Connecticut. All the busts and statues on the front represent people who had significance in the development of California, the European development of California. You have Father Sarah, now Saint Sarah, on the top, Cabrillo, Velasquez, Vizcaino, different explorers are on busts and statues. At the top, on the right and the left, you have the King of Spain and the King of Mexico. That was still then during the 1915 Exposition. The California Tower, the Bell Tower. The carillons play every 15 minutes. You can tell what time it is by how many times it rings. And then on the top is a replica of the ship that Cabrillo, the San Salvador, that Cabrillo sailed into San Diego Bay, the first European settler. So now you're probably wondering, how did Balboa get his name on Balboa Park instead of somebody like Cabrillo? Well, they had a long debate about it. The paper even did a contest, but they ended up with Balboa. And the reason they did it with Balboa is because Balboa was the first European explorer to see the Pacific Ocean. When he was coming across on his first voyage across the Atlantic, he landed in Panama, thinking he had found the Indies like they all had, started conversing with the natives, and they said, no, there's another ocean. He said, well, let me see it. So they took him up on this hill, and he looked out and was the first European explorer to see the Pacific Ocean. But now a little history of the significance of Balboa Park in San Diego. So as I mentioned, when they did the first one, there are two goals. One, to attract the military. The second was to increase commerce. The Exposition in San Diego was so successful in 1915, they decided, hey, we don't need to tear these down right now. Let's just keep them up, and we'll go 2 years. San Francisco closed their World's Fair, and a lot of their exhibitors actually came down here to exhibit on the second one, on the second year, because there were several of the exhibitors here had only enough money and commitment for 1 year, so they were leaving. They had empty buildings, or areas in buildings that were empty. The other people came down and backfilled it. So in a 2-year period, a town of 40,000 people attracted 7.2 million visitors. Check off commerce. Finally closed the exposition at the end of 1916. You may remember that through a short time after, in 1917, the United States entered World War I. 3 days after they declared war, President Roosevelt was on the phone saying, San Diego, you have those buildings you're going to tear down. Can we use them as a boot camp and a hospital? So they took over the entire park until 1922, turned the buildings back to the city in 1923. The reason it took that long is because they had completed construction and opening of the Marine Corps Recruit Depot, MCRD, and the Naval Training Center, NTC. So they didn't need the buildings anymore. They had built the first phase of the Navy Hospital, and the original building for the Navy Hospital is still over there. So that's why we have the park given to us in 1923. At the time, the people said, I know you're supposed to tear these down, but we like them. So Richard Requa, the architect, got together, developed a plan, and found that he could replace these, repair these buildings and save them for less money than it would cost to tear them down. Shortly after the bombing occurred in Pearl Harbor, Washington, D.C. got a hold of the city and said, hey, you let us use them during World War I. Can we use them again? Mainly as a hospital. So this became the location for the nurses and the military people who are here to help the wounded soldiers when they came back to the United States. So this is a photograph in 1942, I think was the exact year, of the women relaxing out here on lawn chairs between their shifts. 1977, the National Park Service dedicated Balboa Park as a National Historic Landmark and National Historic Cultural District. And that's what gave us the protection of the buildings on anything that they wanted to do with them in the future. This is the Persian rug fountain. It's one of the only ones in the United States that we can find. Very unique, very calming. People come and just sit here and watch the fountain. This is called a rainbow eucalyptus. During this, it's pretty much going dormant right now. During the summer, this whole thing lights up like a rainbow. The Navy took over Balboa Park. That's the lily pond. We can go about the same place it was taken from. But they used the lily pond as a place to train sailors how to row boats and how to swim during World War I. During World War II, they actually filled it in. It used to be 5 feet deep, and they made it so it's about 4 feet deep, and it was used as a therapy pool for injured soldiers. So down at this end, you'll get 2 examples of respecting Goodhue's wishes of not having them look the same, and B. Eventon's wishes of keeping them the same in the architecture. This building over here is the Reuben H. Fleet Science Center, home to the first IMAX theater in the world. It now has 3 of them. You can see the design, a little modern, but still respecting the Spanish colonial architecture. This is the Natural History Museum. The Firemen's Ball was having their annual party. They came and decorated it, got back here in their tuxedos ready to celebrate in time to put a fire out, and it burned to the ground. So they had to rebuild it. When they rebuilt it, the Natural History Museum was moving in, and they didn't have enough money to build the whole building. It used to be another T-shaped building, and they didn't have enough money to build it all, so they only built the front half. And I'll show you again the respect they had for the old versus the new. More than 235 varieties of bushes, more than 2,000 bushes, and as you see, they're still in bloom in December. We'll prune them the 3rd week of January, and 6 to 8 weeks they'll be back in bloom, full bloom again. In 2002, they added on the new addition, which made it to the original size. If you look at the parapet up top, you'll see the different color is slightly different from one to the other, because the architect, Dick Bundy, a longtime friend of mine, wanted to separate the old and the new. If you look at the tops of the windows, the cornices on the windows, the parapets, see the design is different. A lot of reflection, same size or shape window, both surrounded by columns. One's more ornate and one's more plain. So here you can see the north side of the Natural History Museum. Part of the Casa del Prado. That's the Casa del Prado Theater. The original building had a building all the way across, but it's now home to 3 youth entertaining organizations: the San Diego Youth Symphony, the San Diego Youth Ballet, and the San Diego Junior Theater. All perform out of there. It's about 500 seat, depending on who's using it, theater. And this is the Moreton Bay Fig Tree. I remember as a kid we used to come over and climb on it and everything. But you'll notice it's fenced now, and people go, well, why did you fence it? Well, the root system on a Moreton Bay fig is very close to the surface of the ground. So there were so many people playing and everything, it was beginning to compact the root system and kill the tree. This is what it looked like in 1915. Planted out of a 5-gallon bucket.
built in 1910. These are all wood, all hand carved. We've done a lot of restoration work. I just painted these dogs recently, so they look pretty good. But I've got a team of volunteers who help me restore the animals too. A lot of these animals have a lot of thick paint hiding the detail that the carvers put in. You know, see all this nice detail here. This is all hidden. It's called the lead horse. It's the most decorated horse on the carousel. It's got the most roses or whatever. You know, all the females love to, women and girls like this horse the best. But yeah, the gentleman who's going to be painting the stork just finished this eagle not too long ago. See how good that looks? His name's Tom Trine, and I went to the factory. Well, the factory is now a museum. It's where the factory is in North Tonawanda, New York, upstate New York. It's the Herschel Spillman factory, and the factory is now a museum. And I went there specifically to see if I could learn what some of the original colors were. And the curator, a real nice guy, took me to their archives upstairs where the public doesn't go, and he let me photograph an original Herschel Spillman illustrated catalog, which has all the original. Well, there were only 14, but he let me take pictures of all 14, and one of them was our armored horse, which is on the other side. So we know, we'll get to it, but we know that at least that animal is in the original colors that they did in 1910. A company put in a fire suppression company put in a sprinkler system up there. Just this is all wood, you know. Carousel has more than just horses. It's called a menagerie carousel. This is a menagerie carousel. The outer animals are called standers. They do not go up and down. The inner two rows, jumpers, go up and down. But this is the armored horse that I was telling you about, and this, I'm pretty confident this is the exact way it looked in 1910, the colors and everything. The original General Electric motor was patented even before 1910 when the carousel was built. Well, every 6 years or so we have a company take it out and just, you know, refurbish it. You know. If you pay enough money, you can sponsor an animal. You get a plaque, you get to name the animal. This one's named Kenny. I painted this one about 6 years ago. And well, I read that the Herschel Spillman painters, they put, I think, 7 coats of lacquer over the paint to protect it, you know. And so I put 7 coats of polyurethane, we call it now, to protect this one. And it's done pretty good. It's a soft hardwood, so it's one of the softer spectrum of the hardwoods. A lot of the carousels today are built just for children, you know, they're kiddie carousels. These were built for adults. This was the thrill ride of the day over 100 years ago, you know, and later roller coasters came along. But these go 13 miles an hour on the outside, and your typical carousel that's built today goes about 7 miles an hour. So.
Village is maintained by all the artists, and they come out and refurbish the colors on them all the time. They're all local artists, and the stuff is just amazing that you can buy here. And when I say art, people think, oh, painting. No, they have glass blowing, they have pottery making, they have gemology at the end. One of the best coffee carts in the park, Daniel's, is right up at the end there. Those are 3 of the 5 Spanish artists who are on the front of the Museum of Art. When they had to rebuild the building, instead of tearing them down, they saved them because they have to get moldings to put up the replacements on their building. Look at these. Those are just, they take those and they make fiberglass molds, and then they make permanent replacements that go up actually on the building. original. If you look on the back side, you'll see one of them is covered up. It's covered up because it was a swastika. They were gifts from the German government.